Welcome to the midweek Bible class. We've got one of our fantastic local speakers, and we've got a brilliant subject tonight that he covered, coming out of 2 Corinthians 3, right up to chapter 4, verse 6. So we're very much looking forward to those inspiring thoughts from the scriptures. So we might just open with a word of prayer. Firstly, by taking a reading from 2 Corinthians 3, and Brother Tim is kindly offered to read that for us. Thanks, Tim. At this point, I'll hand it over to
I might just get a show of hands. Who was at Brother Waz's recent Bible class? Higher. We're at 58%, 60%. We're at 60%. Some of the things that I recently discovered, I was preparing, Brother Waz already covered off on. So you will notice we're doing chapter 3, not chapters 1 and 2. So we don't double up as much. So I just wanted to run through a few things. Obviously, contextually, this is a good little refresher for those that weren't here last week, and also if you were here last week, then it's still a good refresher. So a little bit of a breakdown of the second epistle. The first 10 verses of chapter 1 deals with Paul basically salutations and thanksgivings, a bit of an introduction. And then from there on to chapter 7, it's all about his sustained and appealing self-vindication in light of the Corinthians' sort of change in attitudes towards Paul. Chapters 8 to 9 deals with the Jerusalem fund appeal. Chapters 10 to 13 is a self-defense of Paul, and in reference to the attitude of a particular sect of people. And then chapter 13 ends with a final epilogue. Just a quick comparison of the two epistles, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. Anyone that's sort of read through both these letters will potentially agree with this. You have a very structured breakdown of the first letter. So basically there's questions that are posed to Paul, and he answers them in a systematic way. There's a variety of topics. So you've got factions, meats, idols, spiritual gifts, resurrection, all these things. And it's personal to the Corinthians, but it's not autobiographical. Whereas the second epistle is very unstructured. He sort of shifts from one topic to another without much there's not a lot of reasoning behind it. It's repetitive. It's one topic almost throughout the whole second epistle, and it's about Paul's vindication, and it is very much autobiographical. A lot of the things is to do with Paul sort of defending himself and defending the apostles. So we'll kind of see a little bit of that in the start of this chapter. So just a comparison of the letters continued. For those that were here last week, does anyone recall how many letters were written to the Corinthians? 4. Lovely. So we've got our earlier letter, so pre-1 Corinthians. He says, I wrote to you in my letter. So this is not the letter that he's currently writing. It's a pre-letter. The first epistle, so he deals with now concerning. So he's writing about the things he's now writing about in the first epistle. Now, the admonitory letter is this third elusive letter that got sent pre-2 Corinthians. And it's these little phrases, I wrote to you out of much affliction, that we pick up in 2 Corinthians. And we'll kind of deal with that in a second. And then you obviously have the second epistle, which was delivered by Titus. And there's more reasonings behind this, because he's anxious to get back some news about the admonitory letter that he sends. So before we keep jumping into it, I suppose a question is, does it matter that we know there's this little admonitory letter in there? Does it really matter if we know that or not? Does it matter if we think that Paul is writing to them out of much anguish and affliction, if that's referring to 1 Corinthians? Does that actually matter, or does it not matter?
It probably does.
Well, it probably does, is what I think.
Otherwise, you'd think that he was getting all sorry about the first
Yes.
letter.
Yeah. And exactly. So you think he's getting upset, and he actually says later down the track, he says that he regrets it. And can we really say that Paul would have regretted writing 1 Corinthians? I don't think we could, because there's so much that we use out of 1 Corinthians to base a lot of what we do today. And to call into question this regret would be to call into question everything he wrote about. So there's a few things in this. So firstly, the first epistle. So the reason why it can't be the first epistle, there's a general mood of confidence and serenity. The Apostle Paul is anxious, but he's not flustered when he's writing the first epistle. And I'm going to refer to the first epistle as 1 Corinthians, even though there's an earlier letter. So he's anxious, but he's not flustered. At every opportunity, Paul expresses quiet confidence in the response of his readers. But when he feels that there's a few people that are being people that are being stubborn, Paul is a bit curt with them. So he sort of chops off that stubbornness. Around 22 times he addresses them warmly as brethren. He talks of them in 1 Corinthians as his beloved children that are as dear to him as Timothy is. And he actually calls them beloved 3 times as well. So, and then at the end of 1 Corinthians, Paul concludes his letter by having this option: do I come to you with the rod? I'll whack it out of you, whack the nonsense out of you, or do I come to you with love? And he reaffirms his desire to see them. And he says in the final verses, 1 Corinthians, my love be with you all in Christ Jesus. So it's kind of hard for us to think that when he's writing in his second epistle, that I wrote to you out of much anguish and affliction, it's hard to sort of marry those two thoughts together. So in conjunction with these observations, it forces us to the conclusion that this mysterious admonitory letter in question, which caused Paul anguish and was actually sent to put right a sorry state of affairs that happened after 1 Corinthians was penned. So Paul was obviously wanting to come back to the Corinthians in a joyful, happy state, but he felt that he needed something to be set right. So he sends this admonitory letter. So, yeah, I hope that wasn't too much of a double up from last week, but I just felt like that was a fun thing for me to sort of discover, and I'm happy to share that with you.
Just a random question. Is the earlier letter and the admonitory letter, are they inspired letters?
They must have been. They must have been. They must have been inspired not to be recorded for us too. Now, photos. This is just to give you a little bit of context around Corinth. I had the pleasure of going there earlier this year. So this is a bit of like a snapshot of the whole old city of Corinth. They had their own little amphitheatre as well. They had their own Corinthian games. That's on the sort of the right-hand side. You sort of had the town square, that long rectangle on the left. That's sort of like where all the... Oh, sorry, I'm getting mixed up. I'm not going to pretend to know exactly where that is. This is a better shot. On the left there, that's sort of their town shop centre. And you can see the little billboard down the bottom, what it looked like. On the right here, is a little engraving that they've written: "For this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison," from 2 Corinthians 13, I think. I can't remember if there are passages there, but it's just interesting. Where that block is actually placed is where Paul was presented to Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia at the time. So it's kind of elevated. It's above the main town. So when Paul was presented to Gallio, this is where it would have been. Now, interestingly, when I was there, I was sort of thinking, where was the synagogue? Because that's where Paul went to preach every day when he was there in Acts 18 for 2.5 years. He goes to the synagogue every day, and I was thinking, where the heck is this synagogue? Because everything's in pieces. And what proof do we have that there was a synagogue of the Jews in Corinth? So that up there is actually an inscription. So that would have been a lintel over the entryway. And it says, this is the synagogue of the Jews. So that's a really cool little thing that made me feel happy when I found that. This is me, Lawrence and Annie. And that's the Temple of Apollos behind us. And then the mountain behind us is the Acro-Corinth. So that's actually a Roman colonized town. They built a city up there. This is walking in the main street. So somewhere on the right, they discovered the synagogue of the Jews lintel over the doorway. So you can see people actually used to go all the way up there, and he didn't believe me. People used to go all the way up there by foot. Obviously, there was no other way. And they went up there, and there's basically a massive city up there. So we drove. That makes sense. But you're very much elevated above sea level. So it's a long way for people to go. And they used to sort of party and get all into all that sort of stuff in this Roman-based city at the top of this mountain. So if the main town didn't suit their needs, they'd go all the way up here. So you can see all the walls and towers and spires and all that sort of stuff that there is up there, which is a feat of itself. Every time I saw a building on a mountain, I'm like, I can't even imagine building that. I would hate to be a labourer back then, but they obviously managed to do it. So that just gives you a bit of an overview of sort of the area in which these Corinthians are living. So coming to our chapter tonight, so it starts off with a letter of commendation, this dealing with a letter of commendation, I should say. And it goes into this old and new glory. We're going to talk about the veil, and then we're going to sort of briefly mention this unveiled light at the end. So Paul says at the start, am I beginning to commend myself? Do I need, like some of you, to be commended by written letters from either of you? And he says, you make it obvious in verse 3 that you are a letter of Christ, which I have been employed to inscribe, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of the human heart. So Paul says, I don't actually need a handwritten letter like other self-appointed teachers do to be accepted or approved. He says, I have you. I don't need a piece of paper in my... Is that time? Oh, damn. So he says, I don't need a letter. It's fun. So if we're down here where I've got compare little scriptures, feel free to write them in your margin next to these spots. But other people did actually carry these letters or these sort of they would either be letters or other brothers would go before these teachers and provide a good report of the people that were coming. So it was customary for people traveling to actually carry a letter of recommendation. So they're recommended. So that's that commended sort of phrase there. in the first verse. So Paul's reply suggests that he did not need to produce such letters for his authority to kind of be stamped, you could say.
Which is, if I could just make an interesting little observation, which he definitely did need and did have when he was persecuting the Christians.
For sure.
He had letters of authority from the high priest.
Yeah.
And no saying through that.
Yeah. So he says to them, I've actually taught you, Corinthians, and I've transformed you into something else. So you've changed, and the evidence of how you've changed can be seen by everyone. And he says, if that isn't enough, he says actually that you as an ecclesia, you're not just my letter of recommendation or commendation, but you're actually a recommendation of Christ. Okay, so it's not just showing Paul. Paul isn't the person that's changed you. It's actually Christ that they're showing. So Paul alludes in that last verse to tablets of stone. So he starts going into a little bit of a spiel about Judaizers here and their beliefs and their law keeping. And Paul is almost directly referencing Jeremiah 31, where he says, "Behold, the days are coming when I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day that I took them by hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant I will make with them. After those days, declares the Lord, I'll put my law within them and I'll write it on their hearts, and I will be their God and they will be my people." So this prophecy was fulfilling itself, okay? And Paul's reason for such confidence, his knowledge that God called him. So he says in verse 4, "Such is the confidence that we have through Christ towards God. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything, but our sufficiency is from God, who made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life." So here Paul's kind of drawing this line in the sand. He's asserting some very obvious contrast and opposition here. So the letter kills, the tablet of stone kills, but the Spirit gives life. And that's what he's wanting to draw upon in this next little section. He says, "The ministry of death is carved in stones, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at the face of Moses because of its glory, which was being brought to an end. Will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? For if there is glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness must far exceed its glory. Indeed, in this case, what was once had glory that was coming to pass to have no glory at all, because of the glory that's passed." There's a lot of glories in there, and you can sort of see he's making this contrast in all these verses. He had this old covenant, that glory had glory, he's not denying that, but it was fading. But then you've got this new covenant, which is not going to fade. It's kind of similar language. If you've turned up Romans 3, verse 19 to 25, that's another good reference. But it's similar language to Romans 5, verse 9 to 10, where he says, "Since therefore we've been justified by his blood, much more will we be saved from him, from the wrath of God. For if we were enemies, we were reconciled by the death of his son. How much more will we be reconciled by the life?" So you had this old glory, and that still did something. But then you have this new glory, and it's just going to outweigh and outstrip and outdo everything else that this old thing was doing, this old covenant. And it's similar language that he uses. If you're going to be saved by death, how much more are you going to be saved by life? And this is referencing Christ.
just a comment in regard to the fading glory. So I'm thinking of, when Moses spoke to God, his face shone, and they couldn't approach Moses because of that. It was a fading glory.
Yes.
We've got that really interesting, I think, perhaps it's a comparison, in chapter 4, verse 6, which speaks about God who commanded the light to shine out of darkness.
Yep.
It's shone in the face
Yes.
Of Christ.
Yes.
This is the knowledge of the glory of God.
For sure.
Which obviously wasn't going to fade.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. So here I've done a little cross comparison of everything that Paul does in this chapter, where he talks about basically the law and the gospel, okay, and how these two things, one sort of does away with the other. So first verses 1 to 2, it's written letters of recommendation on paper. But what God's after is written letters of recommendation on hearts. One's written with ink, the other is written with the Spirit of the living God. It's on tablets of stone, but God wants tablets on human hearts. One is sufficient of self, and one is sufficient from God. One is a minister of the letter, and one is a minister of the Spirit. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. The ministry of death comes with glory, but the ministry of Spirit has more glory. The ministry of condemnation had glory. The ministry of righteousness exceeds former ministry's glory. First ministry now has no glory. The second ministry now has the glory. The temporary ministry had glory. The permanent ministry has more glory. So we changed tenses halfway through there because of the introduction of Christ. Once Christ was put into the picture, everything was done away with. So that's why it says the ministry of condemnation had glory. It doesn't have glory anymore. It had glory. So let's leave that there. So Paul does two things in verse 7. He names the law of Moses as the ministry of death. So he further discredits that way of life. And he uses the law and its witnesses at those events surrounding the delivery of the law of Moses. So he uses the Israelites as a witness. So in Romans 7, verse 7 to 12, he says, "What shall we say then? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, 'You shall not covet.' But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died." He concludes there, so the law is holy, the commandment is holy and righteous and good. So in this Romans section, Paul explains that the purpose of the law is to highlight sin that didn't know what sin was, that they were doing wrong. So in highlighting sin, people now realized what they'd done wrong and that it was worthy of death. But Paul doesn't just say that the law is useless. He does conclude by saying that it's holy, just, and good commandment. So it's not without use. Despite it being a form of glory, it's not without its uses. And 2 Corinthians 3, verse 7 also refers to the arrival of the Ten Commandments that came with so much glory. So he is still saying that it did have uses, did come with glory, and it came with so much glory, as John previously said, that the children of Israel could not gaze at the face of Moses. So we'll just go quickly to Exodus 34, which is what we're referencing when we're talking about the Israelites not being able to look at the face of Moses. So Exodus 34, verse 29 to 35. So when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, as he came down from the mountain, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone, because he had been talking with God. Aaron and all the people of Israel saw Moses, and behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the congregation returned to him, and Moses talked with them. Afterwards, all the people of Israel comes near, and he commanded them all that the Lord had spoken with him in Mount Sinai. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. Whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would remove the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the people of Israel what he was commanded, the people of Israel would see the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face was shining, and Moses would put the veil over his face again until he went in to speak with him, him being Yahweh or the Lord. So Moses effectively, to paraphrase here, comes down with the 10 commandments. His face is glowing. Israel is scared and afraid of this glowing man. Who wouldn't be afraid of a glowing man, a glow stick man, right? And they eventually do come close to Moses, but it was with after speaking with the Israelites, he covers his face with a veil. So then he's got his face covered with a veil. Every time he then goes up and speaks with God or into God, he removes the veil, comes before God, he removes the veil, speaks with God. Then on his way back down or on his way back out, he will cover his face again when he comes towards the Israelites. So it's a bit of an odd thing. What is the point of this veil? Question for the crowd. What purpose does this veil serve for the Israelites?
They can't see the glory fading.
Yep. I had another. Is someone going to say the same thing? Very good. That survey says 100. So 2 Corinthians 3:13 says, not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. So Moses hid and covered his face so that no one would see his shining face fade, so that no one knew of this temporary glory. As far as the Israelites were pretty much concerned, Moses' face was shining constantly, right? Because they couldn't see it. So even at this stage, way back when the law was given, it was still fading. Even though it was holy, just, and good, it was still temporary. It didn't last. It was divinely given, but it was only temporary.
It was almost as if the nation of Israel didn't want the law to ever be done away with. The glory of the law. No, we want to keep the law. Because this sort of justifies our.
Yeah, at the time, it probably wouldn't have been that, but eventually it definitely did become that, because Paul writes later, the veil lay over their hearts. Whenever Moses was read, a veil laid over their hearts. So they actually were pretty content with the way the law was working.
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure, it did definitely become that for the Israelites and the Jews. The Jeremiah quote we already looked at knew that this law was temporary. So Jeremiah 31:31, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, not like the covenant I made with the fathers. So we've already mentioned that quote. And all the way back then, it said that the days are going to come when a new covenant will be established. So it was already pre-planned that this would be a temporary thing. As if the fading of the glory wasn't enough, it's written that a new covenant is going to be coming. So Paul's counter proposal to this temporary covenant is a covenant that is eternal, unchanging, and more glorious. A new covenant, as Jeremiah says, will be based on Christ. Under this covenant, we no longer have a veil covering glory. It is free and it's accessible because this glory does not fade. So 14 to 16 in 2 Corinthians. But their minds were hardened, for to this day, when they read the old covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts, but when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. So if you compare that with Hebrews 8, verse 10, this is actually Paul quoting Jeremiah. He says, "For this is the covenant I'll make with the house of Israel. I'll put my laws into their minds," rendered as inward parts or inside them in the original quote, "and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." So it's a pretty similar quote. It's almost like for like of what was in Jeremiah. And you can see, you can read the law is on their minds and hearts, but it wasn't affected. Their hearts were not affected. If I just go back, oh, no, it's still there. So their hearts were not affected. The veil still lies over it, okay? So because this veil was not only covering Moses' face, it was also covering their hearts. So there was no access. There was this physical barrier to their hearts, this veil. So Paul, being Paul, understood the power of the cross. It says, through Christ, the veil is taken away. And you'd probably only need to go to Romans 3 and look at Paul's explanation of the atonement to get a small insight to Paul's understanding of the power of the cross. But this veil, what is this veil? This veil that is there, that is removed. Is it the veil that Moses was wearing? Is it the veil that lies over their hearts? Is there another veil? Well, the veil of the law is lifted, okay? When one turns to the Lord, that's what it says. But potentially there is another veil that we may know very well of. Exodus 26, and those of you that were here for Matt's classes on the tabernacle, or if you're familiar with his content, probably covered the veil in the tabernacle. Then you shall erect the tabernacle according to the plan that you were shown on the mountain. You shall make a veil of blue and purple and scarlet yarns and fine twined linen. It shall be made with cherubim skillfully worked into it. And you shall hang it from the 4 pillars of acacia overlaid with gold, with hooks of gold on 4 bases of silver. And you shall hang the veil from the clasps and bring the ark of the testimony in there within the veil. And the veil shall separate for you the holy place from the most holy. So there's our tabernacle. There's a veil that is between, I think it's legend item 2. If you can see the 2 and you can't see the veil, look for the 2. It's a barrier between 2 rooms, or a curtain, okay? Not only did it serve to separate the rooms physically, but also separate the rooms in terms of what those rooms actually stood for and who could actually access these rooms. The holy place represented mortal service with its constant daily reminder of ceaseless toil, while the most holy place represented immortal service. Mortality in the holy place did not have a part in the most holy place of immortality. The most holy place was only entered once a year by the high priest, a representation of Christ. The day that they enter is the Day of Atonement. So a sacrifice is made by the priest who caught the blood, enters through the first veil, image 7 or 6, not 8, enters through the first veil into the holy place, then through the second one, the most holy place, sprinkles the blood on the mercy seat, the meeting place, and God's glory shines on the priest's face. And Israel knew that they had been atoned for. It's interesting that all of these concepts kind of come together this idea of glory shining and the way Paul strings all this together. The fact that Moses' face shines, the high priest's face shines, and the fact that Christ is the one that removes this veil. So Matthew 27, verse 50 to 51, and Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. So Christ's death removed the veil, the barrier between these two rooms, the holy place and the most holy place. And it allows us access to immortality, allows us access to forgiveness, and allows us access to a new covenant which has no fading glory. But we need to turn to Christ. We need to allow our hearts and minds to be open and not veiled, as the Israelites were under the old covenant. So Paul picks up this concept in Corinthians. Now the Lord is the Spirit. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So there's access, there's liberty. And we all, with unveiled face, behold the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. So every time that this shining effect, this glory is presented, and Moses' face shines, his glory is actually being changed. Back in the time of Moses, it was temporary, right? But now that we've got access with Christ, it is a permanent glory change. So when he's talking about we've got one degree to another, and this comes from the Lord, we now have this access to life. We have this access to a new relationship to God. It's a new covenant. And this one doesn't fade, but it progressively increases in resemblance to Christ. So the more we go to see Christ, the more we resemble him, the more we will shine, the more we will reflect his glory. And that obviously goes back to God's purpose for us to be filled with God's glory, to be a true image of God. And that's what we have been transformed to be. So now that we have this access, now that the veil is lifted and it's torn, we have this access, this opportunity, this liberty to be transformed. That CP Leviticus 14, it's just a reference to the cleansing of the lepers back in the time of the wilderness wanderings. And the priest would go through this rigorous exercise, this rigorous sort of things and sacrifices that he had to do to cleanse a leper. Now, all of this was done so that the leper could be transformed from one glory of being diseased and death to another, to life and a new body, effectively. But even that was a temporary thing because it didn't actually save. Okay, they still ended up dying. Okay, but it was still this process that they had to go through from changing from one glory to another. So when we think about our calling, how we need to be affected by this new covenant, Christ opens the way and gives us access. And it's so that we can actually write this new covenant on our hearts and minds. That's the key issue here with the Corinthians. He wants them to have this written on their hearts, not just a set of rules that you chuck up on your door at home or at the back of the toilet door or wherever you put them in, your photo frames on your walls. It needs to be within you, okay? And we can sort of do this too. We can put a veil over our hearts. We can sometimes choose when we want Christ to affect us and when we don't want Christ to affect us. We can kind of snip, snap, snip, snap, snip, snap between the two. And we can do the same thing as the Corinthians and the Judaizers. Now, at the start, Paul's letter of recommendation that he didn't carry, the Corinthians were that recommendation, that commendation of Paul. And he says that, they need to actually be a recommendation or a commendation letter of Christ. So it's not, don't think of it as Paul transforming the Corinthians from one glory to another. Think of it as Christ transforming them from one glory to another. Because when people saw the Corinthians, Paul didn't want them to think, oh, they're just like Paul. He dealt with that in the first epistle. He says, don't say you're of Paul. Don't say you're of Apollos. Don't say you're of Cephas. We're all one in Christ. So when he says you're a commendation for Christ, when people saw the Corinthians, Paul wanted them to see Jesus. And that's what we need to do as well. When people see us, they don't want to just see, I don't know, Reuben Ryan or Jamin Ryan or Lockie Smith. They want to see Christ. We need to have that sort of showing on our face. It needs to be obvious. And that's sort of the point that Paul's getting to here. Let's continue. I've missed the verse, that's right. So 2 Corinthians 4 verse 6 says, for God who said, light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. There you have it. The light of the glory in the face of Jesus. So Jesus is also reflecting the same glory of God. Okay. And we need to have that same light shine. And this light of knowledge that is in our hearts, we are working towards the example of Christ has left for us. And if you look at this last quote on the screen, which is Hebrews 1 verse 3, it says, he's the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purifications for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. Now, I did have another quote that I wanted to read. I probably skipped where this is relevant, but Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19 to 22 says, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is his flesh, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart. There you have those key phrases there, with a heart full of assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean. There you have that reference to the high priest, sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. So I hope that some of this was new, and even if it wasn't new, I hope it was a good reminder of some of the things that Paul's written down in somewhat of a complex book, but going through it sort of piece by piece, I think it kind of makes sense. Yeah, that's pretty much it from me. Thanks.